Welcome, welcome to Literary Lights, a series that spotlights new books by contemporary Armenian authors, hosted by the International Armenian Literary Alliance, the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, and the Krikor and Clara Zorab Information Center. Today's event, co-sponsored by the Gallus LGBTQ+ Armenian Society, features mycologist Patricia Ononiwu Kaishian and Forest Euphoria, The Abounding Queerness of Nature, a brilliant book that Robin Wall Kimmerer called an antidote to the loneliness of our species. It will challenge the way you perceive the world around you and challenge our expectations, as Patty writes, of what is normal, beautiful, and possible. It will also make the writers and readers in this room rethink who and what we center our stories around. I'd like to introduce Nancy Krikorian, our moderator for today's event. Nancy is the author of 4 novels about post-genocide Armenian diaspora experience, including Zabel, which was translated into 7 languages, adapted as a play, and has been continuously in print since 1998. Her essays and poems have appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, Guernica, Parnassus, Minnesota Review, the Mississippi Review, and other journals. She's taught at Barnard, Columbia, Yale, and NYU, as well as Teachers and Writers Collaborative in the New York City Public Schools, and for the Palestine Writing Workshop in Birzeit. She has been the recipient of a New York Foundation for the Arts Fellowship, a gold medal from the Writers Union of Armenia, and the Anahit Literary Award. Her most recent novel is The Burning Heart of the World, a poignant coming-of-age story set largely in Beirut during the Lebanese Civil War. It was featured in this series in April, and you can find the reading and discussion on our YouTube channel. If you haven't read it, you must. It's a deeply human story and a meditation on Armenian identity. You can find the link to purchase it in the chat. Nancy, thank you so much for hosting this conversation.
Thanks, Olivia, and thank you so much for the shout out for my book. I'm really excited to be here today for Yala and its partners in conversation with my good friend Patty Kaishian about her beautiful new book, Forest Euphoria. I want to show you the cover. It's so beautiful. And I want to encourage everybody to go out and buy the book. And if it's a budget problem, the other way to support the book is to get it from your local public library. And if it isn't already on the shelf, to request that they order it. So I'm going to read a little introduction about my relationship with Patty and a little more about Patty. So in early December 2021, I listened to a podcast interview with Dr. Patricia Ononiwu, mycologist. I was so entranced by what I heard that I contacted her via Bard College, where she was teaching at the time. Dear Patricia, I wrote, I listened to your For the Wild interview this morning and was thrilled by the way you brought together mushrooms, queer theory, and Armenians. Your description of the situation in Artsakh and the trauma last year's war reactivated in all of us was one of the most succinct and clearest explanations I have heard. I am part of the recent new horde of mushroom enthusiasts, although my interest is more than culinary. Anyways, I'm a fan and thought I would reach out to you. Maybe I could do a profile of you for the Armenian Weekly. There followed a lively correspondence and a few Zoom calls, which resulted in a January 26, 2022 article for the Armenian Weekly entitled Dr. Patricia Ononiwu, Advocate for Diversity of Life, Advocate for Armenia. The piece covers the founding of the International Congress of Armenian Mycologists, or ICAM. In response to the war in Artsakh, in November 2020, Kaishian joined forces with 3 other young Armenian mycologists of Armenian descent to found ICAM, which seeks to study the biodiversity of Armenia and materially support the work of mycologists in the country. Armenians, and Patty said, Armenians are so often defined by struggle and conflict, but we wanted to find a way to make a meaningful impact on Armenian culture and society through this project that was positive and forward-looking. We wanted to leverage our skills as scientists to advocate for Armenia. Patty and I have been friends ever since, and I'm thrilled to be in conversation with her today about her brilliant and best-selling new book, Forest Euphoria, The Abounding Queerness of Nature. This book weaves together Patty's careful observations about the marginal creatures of the natural world, both non-human and human, with autobiographical incident. It is a work that makes connections between living creatures and the histories, geographies, and political economies that shape them. Patty's worldview is informed by a deep love for all life forms, and her approach is an antidote to loneliness and estrangement. And now Patty's going to read a little bit from the book, and after that, she and I will have a conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Nancy. That was a very sweet introduction. I feel like we've been friends at once for like much longer than it has been, but also I remember those early encounters very clearly. It was very exciting to connect with you. And thank you so much for being in conversation with me here today. And I'm just very happy to be here with everyone. I love being in community with Armenians whenever possible. So. Thank you so much. Sorry, my curl went wild. Gotta tuck it back in. Okay, so I am going to read a little bit. I just have two sort of small sections to read today, and then leaving, more time for conversation with Nancy, and then hopefully, questions and comments from anyone here. I think it's important to define sort of the term queer and the way that I deploy it in the book, because there are many layers to the definition. And this book really is a collection of different chapters all about different organisms, species, or systems that are queer either in this very literal reproductive sense or in a more abstract sense. So I'll read a section that kind of explains a bit about the way I'm using the term queer. So, queer is the overarching term for a whole smattering of ways of being that defy expectations of sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and family structure. While the word is used to be an insult to describe behaviors outside of what was normal or heteronormative, queer was reclaimed in the AIDS political activism of the 1980s and 1990s, bringing together different subgroups for whom the terms gay and lesbian did not apply. Importantly, queer is a call to action, charging us to reject the many binaries that shape our current reality to the detriment of everyone. And while queer is used primarily to describe categories of sex and gender that are not considered normal in today's culture, the term can also be used more broadly for anything that complicates our ideas of what is normal versus what is deviant. Queer theory asks, what has been categorized as normal and why? How does the structure of our society, in the forms of race, gender, religion, orientation, ability, and even species, reinforce this categorization? The binary rules in our culture, male versus female, white versus black, straight versus queer, are used to make hierarchy. Within each of these categories, there is a set of traits that is seen as more desirable, more aspirational, and a set of traits that is seen as weaker, unseemly, disgusting, or degenerate. The people with the normal traits are positioned as superior, dominant to the deviant groups. By focusing on the ways in which one group differs from another, a distance is created between the superior group and the subjugated group, and within that space, domination and violence occur. So I'm in this book, I'm using queerness as a literal description of the non-heteronormative ways that nature exists. So I'm responding to the charge that is so often made that to be queer is unnatural. And that's a legal argument that has been made all around the world and within the United States. And it's sort of just like a social, I guess, like there's the ways in which like society has agreed that it's unnatural. So as a scientist, I wanted to share all of these examples that I've learned through studying science about how, queerness is not only can be found in nature, but is actually extremely common. So it's common within plants, animals, fungi, and other groups as well. So each chapter explores a queer organism, or it's either queer in this very literal reproductive sense in terms of sex or like same-sex behaviors. And I also am exploring this idea of like what is normal in our society? What has been banished? What is considered marginal? What is considered something to be subjugated? And so that's like, for example, I have a chapter about swamps, which explores the history of swamps as these ecosystems that are reviled. And I'm sure in our conversation we can get a little bit more into that, but then um, I will read first. Before we do that, I'll read another section. So, okay. Snakes are reviled in Euro-American culture. Many species are threatened or endangered in Europe and North America due to a combination of habitat destruction and the ignorant and gruesome practice of snake roundups, during which people kill as many snakes as they can. I remember an elementary school classmate of mine, eyes wide with pride, talking about her father's semi-annual snake hunt. He would patrol the perimeter of their suburban home and decapitate any snake he encountered. He would then line up the heads to show his kids before discarding the severed body parts in a trash bin. My classmate's pride stemmed from the fact that she, like her father, believed he was protecting their family. People attempt to justify this slaughter on the basis that snakes are dangerous creatures, which is mostly false. Most species in North America are not venomous at all, posing next to no risk to people. Even the potentially lethal timber rattlesnake, given its species name Horridus by early taxonomist Carl Linnaeus in 1758, has killed only a dozen people in the last 30 years across the entire United States. They are not known to be especially aggressive. They're rather shy, in fact. If they can't flee, they will usually attempt to warn clumsy humans before opting for their last resort. For this reason, it's unsurprising that half the reported bites were not hapless encounters. The victims were allegedly handling snakes, often depicted as agents of the devil in Western Christian stories and imagery, as part of religious services. This hatred of snakes is not universal. In Armenian folklore, snakes are regarded as familiars and guardians, sometimes the translocated souls of beloveds who've passed. They are supernatural animals who appear commonly in folk tales, always in possession of magical powers, and believed to be purveyors of fortune and wisdom. The Armenian holiday of Hampartsum, for example, is a celebration of ascension, magic, nature, and water. People make gatnabor, a pudding of ancient grains and milk. Women bathe with medicinal herbs, and water is collected to be infused by starlight. The evening before, at midnight, time is believed to stand still. Water stops flowing, animals hold their breath. A serpent king begins to speak the language of flowers, and whoever sees him speaking to the flowers is blessed. Saint snakes, as they are called, are our ancestors. Knowledge is shared via contact with their probing and sensitive tongues. I like to think that through many flicks of a snake's tongue, my childhood self was given ancestral knowledge about the earth. Hiding in the dark culvert, saint snakes at my feet, I sensed the cultural blades of conformity passing overhead, mowing down displays of difference and diversity. Saint snakes helped me wait the mowers out, allowing me enough time to grow into my own form. These familiars offered me gentle protections and lessons, talismans from the natural world that would grow and take shape over the course of my life. It was through them, in this culvert, as well as in the forests and swamps around my childhood home, that I felt most euphoric. I learned to bear witness to the profusion of biological forms that surrounded me. I began to see that diversity is not only abundant in nature, but its very premise. The beings of our world are bound together by webby agreements predicated on difference. We all engage in special earthly pacts, trading energy through water, sunlight, iron, and sugar, each of us taking and contributing, each of us necessarily different. These differences are not positive or negative, they simply exist. A water strider is no less evolved than the frog who eats her, who in turn can navigate the world in ways that beguile us as humans. I realized that we, the snakes, the bugs, the streams, the forest, and I, could never leave each other. I was multiple persons, Matthew and Patty, jostling for space, and these organisms were also many in one body. Humans are part of this collective body, whether we choose to protect it or not, whether we choose to remember or not. From the intimacy I developed with creatures of the culvert and the forests, sprouted the resolve to accept my whole self, however slowly, even when social binaries threatened to cut off my watery limbs. Okay.
Thank you, Patty. I have so many questions for you. I wrote up a bunch of questions, and I guess I'm going to start with the one that I, wrote first, which was, since our conversation today is hosted by the International Armenian Literary Alliance, I wanted to start by asking you about Armenianness. Ani Bakalian's pioneering 1993 work of sociology, Armenian Americans, From Being to Feeling Armenian, posited that while first-generation immigrants to America are Armenian, over time their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who stay connected to the community feel Armenian and construct for themselves an Armenian identity that is created from chosen affiliations and networks of belonging. How Armenian do you feel, and how do you feel Armenian?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that I think has taken different forms at different phases of my life. So I grew up in New York, and it was my great-grandparents that came here in 1915. It is three generations removed from living in the country of Armenia. And I do not speak Armenian, sadly. And I didn't grow up in an Armenian community. So for those reasons, sometimes I have this feeling of, not being Armenian enough. And so on certain days, I feel this that there's always there's something that I can't necessarily even change about that feeling. But then there are other times where when I think about kind of exactly that point, that we have to kind of create our own way of being Armenian given the impact of genocide and given the fact that the huge number of Armenians, I believe it's more than the total number living in Armenia today, live in diaspora. And so the Armenian experience is one of sort of reclamation in a lot of ways. It's a valid way of being Armenian, and it's an important part of the Armenian identity today. So I think that I've always deeply felt Armenian. I've always felt that that part of me, I think partly due to even just the phenotype, like the curly hair, the eyes and eyebrows and things, that was just always very conspicuous about me, and it definitely did distinguish me from a lot of the, more European American people I was around. And I guess I also, I've always felt this yearning to be closer to Armenianness whenever I could get it. So anytime there was a way of eating Armenian food or being around my Armenian extended family, Armenian art and music, I was always just sort of hunting for it and thirsty for it. And then finally, I got to go to Armenia in 2021 for the first time, and that was the first time anyone from my lineage had gone back. So that was a very special thing, and that definitely helped bridge this feeling of distance that I had felt. Yeah.
Great. That's it is interesting the way, because in Ani's book she really talks about the way that people choose to construct this identity, and I would think even founding ICAM
Mhm.
a way of asserting that. And then the stuff that you've written actually very beautifully about Artsakh and the connection that Armenians have to the lands that they have been on for centuries, or lands that they were exiled from, during the genocide, have also been very powerful. I'm also really interested in your philosophy of naming.
Hmm.
On page 89, you say, when I name a species, which is something that you've done as a, taxonomist, a scientist, I am not branding it, and I don't see naming as an act of authority. I see it as a way of honoring, a way of recognizing a companion on the tree of life. Naming is my way of offering personhood to fungi, which have done something similar for me. How is your approach to naming different from the traditional one? What is the power in your kind of naming? And does it have incantatory or a magical element?
Yeah, so I think that in the history of taxonomy, there's different approaches to naming. And I think that, there's a lot of variation just based on the individual scientist who's doing the work. So in taxonomy, we talk about the person who described that species as being the authority. And that can be like just sort of in the sense of they know the most about that taxonomic group, which is relevant to, to note. But there's definitely a way in which some taxonomists have taken this sort of, yeah, the authority to a different level in which they feel possessive of that species and that concept, and they might even defend that species concept or the name that they've given against even new information that might be added to the scientific understanding of the group that might shift the name. So sometimes basically when you name a species, it's a hypothesis. You're hypothesizing that this species is distinct from any other previously described species. And you present this material that you used to examine the original material you looked at is retained as a voucher specimen. And then you take really detailed notes on the morphology, like what it looks like, its shape and size of its spores, like in the case of fungi. And then you might also do DNA sequencing and other things. And taken together, that's your hypothesis that this is a new species to science. But new information might come to light that could shift that conclusion, right? Another researcher might examine that material, have a new method to get even, higher resolution information, and they might propose, oh, actually, that's the same as this species. We're really re-examining it. And sometimes in those cases, the original authority can get extremely combative and defensive and say, like, no, like this is, how dare you try to circumscribe this group? And there can be really nasty, nasty fights that take place that are not really scientific, but are more personal than, I think a lot of them would admit. So I think that in the dynamics and the history of the field, there is ways in which I've seen people want to put a stamp of their, authority on a group. And it comes from this sort of Victorian era European culture in which sometimes things were given names that already were known and described and like deeply embedded in cultures outside of Europe. And so to name something was to be and declare this name even when there was already a name in use for that group, and there would be no mention of, even though I understand, to some extent wanting to include it in the naming categorization scheme that science uses, there would be no reference to the original name that may have been used by the culture that in question. So it would be like we're discovering the species, even though it was known for maybe thousands of years. So I wanted to just sort of like acknowledge that history is a big part of Western science, unfortunately, and like this idea that like to name something isn't to possess it. It's in my mind, it is to kind of acknowledge its existence. And I think that I really enjoyed that process for these obscure fungi that I study because they are not really of clear economic value or cultural value. They're very tiny, like tiny fungi that live on insects, and most people have no idea that they exist, and they don't seem to have a potential even in the commercial realm. So to name them for me is to acknowledge that they, nevertheless are here on this earth, that they've been here, that we share a universal common ancestor, and they, with or without human witness, are going to kind of continue to exist and have their own story. And so sort of recognizing their existence and their companionship here on the planet is, I do that. My expression of that is to like give them a name and offer that sort of as a way of honoring them.
When I was listening to you, this is not one of my scripted questions, but I just did have a question because I can't I remember it's what is the thing called the lab? What is the thing
Yeah, the
called?
labules. Yeah.
The laboules, and you came up with a name for a particular laboule. And
Hmm.
the name that you came, describe it because how you came up with the name that you used for that particular one, where you,
Done a few of those. So there was one that was named, it was collected many years ago, like many decades ago. So I didn't collect it, but it was from Suriname. And so I named it after it was from a location in which the Lokono people lived. So I named it after them. I've also named them, one species was living in a bromeliad, which is like a type of plant that grows on like the side of a tree. And then it was on a little insect that lived on the surface of the rainwater that collected in the bromeliad. And so I gave the name that that means like lover of bromeliads.
so
Yeah, so
what I was going to say, the thing that occurred to me when I was listening to you is because when we're talking about the history of science, you're talking about 19th century, we're talking about men. And,
yes.
and I think that the tradition was often that the men attached their own names to the things that they.
Yeah, so that was very common. It's a little less common to give your own name. That's seen as a faux pas, but I mean people have done it for sure. But usually it would be like the name of another scientist, and usually that was therefore often other men. Um,
Right.
yeah, so like there are a lot of European men's names are in circulation taxonomically. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's very interesting because I'm a member. I mean, I'm a amateur naturalist and interested in birds and mushrooms and flowers and trees and blah, blah. And, being a member of the New York City Audubon Society, which has
Yeah.
not changed its name to the New York City Bird Alliance, because there's sort of going back and looking at the names of a lot of these men that were attached to, organisms and organizations, and thinking that maybe there would be, do you know what I mean? There's a sort of reclaiming of things.
Yeah, yeah, the bird world in particular. Luckily, we don't have quite as many um names like that in mycology because we actually just don't have too many common names. We have so many, there's so many fungi, and there are so few mycologists relatively that we mostly use the Latin names, although that's starting to change. But in birds, a lot of the common names are standardized, and yeah, a lot of them were there's a significant number that are named after really awful people. Like not just people with like a small scandal, like people who are like, passionate slaveholders. Like, like
Right.
not
They were not just, they were advocates of slavery, basically.
yes, like really, really bad people. Um, and so, yeah, I'm supportive of those changes for
Yeah.
sure.
All right. Well, I wanted to ask you some questions about writing,
Mhm.
writing process. So the book is really, in a way, a hybrid of sort of natural history and memoir. And I was trying to, I asked you this before when we were talking a couple of weeks ago, but there is a tradition of lately again of these sort of hybrid books. For example, the one that comes to my mind immediately is Maggie Nelson's The Argonauts, but
Yeah.
that one is a sort of hybrid of autobiography and sort of feminist theory. And I was trying to think of ones in the natural world, and I guess I was thinking maybe of Suzanne Simard's Finding the Mother Tree, which is about her education as a, tree scientist, as well as her discoveries. So, did you have in mind from the beginning to do this kind of hybrid where you blended the autobiographical or sort of memoir with the natural history?
Yeah, so not quite. I would say that I always thought there would maybe like some elements of like personal detail, like just maybe about being a scientist and stuff. But then I think I originally approached it and in through a much more I've have formal training as a scientist, and then I have a bachelor's degree in arts. So in college I took a ton of classes on like philosophy and anthropology. I was like an environmental studies minor basically. So I had like but then I really self-educated in queer theory and like feminist theory as well. But I was deeply immersed in the academic writing world. And so I think my like training was having me approach this subject in a fairly depersonalized way, and like just kind of keeping me as the observer or the narrator as like at like kind of an arm's length, which is I think especially an artifact of my science conditioning. But then the more I was writing, the more I was drafting, and also, and working with my editor, it just became more clear that the personal narrative was a big part of the story that I wanted to tell, and that the messages that I most felt I needed to communicate were more personal than what could be delivered through an academic or sort of academically concentrated form. And by that, mean I really wanted people to be having sort of an one of the main things I want to accomplish in the book is helping people form a deeper relationship to nature. And I think that as a scientist, I feel very aware of the shortcomings of science in communicating around climate change and sort of mobilizing people to take action. I think that science is a huge and necessary part of addressing climate change, but a lot of people we've had the data for many decades now, and a lot of people are just not compelled by that. And so I feel like one of the things I've been, thinking a lot about over the last few years is like, well, what other strategies can we deploy? And I do find that some of the personal I thought about some of the most influential writing that I've encountered in my life around nature, and it's usually pretty personal, and it's about forming that connection yourself to nature. So I thought that I felt like I wanted to do that. So how can I kind of give people sort of an example or some instruction around deepening their intimacy to nature? So I think what's lacking often in the scientific approach to solving these problems is a personal ethic and an intimacy of care and love, and sort of seeing yourself as part of nature, seeing yourself as deeply embedded, and having an emotional response to the species that we seek to protect. So I think that if people are going to be motivated to, be a steward of their own, the world that they live in, their own neighborhood or state or country, they have to have like some personal cost that they can feel when something is threatened, as opposed to just like parts per million in the atmosphere, or like some sort of like degree warming threshold. Like that's not going to necessarily, to someone who's not already tapped into that stuff, it's pretty abstract. So how do we make it less abstract and make it more embodied? And that's sort of what I wanted to do in the book.
Right. A theme that is threaded through the book is a commitment to the creation of networks of connection and belonging as an antidote to loneliness, along
Mhm.
with the search for euphoria and joy in daily life. How are these impulses related to your political organizing, which I think you're talking about, your writing as a form of political organizing. I would think also the education work that you do as the head of mycology at the New York State Museum you know, right. So, I mean, maybe it's like the spreading of joy and euphoria, right, is a way of getting people to connect to nature, maybe in a way that motivates them. I mean, is that part of what it is that you're working
Yes.
here?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, so I'm also, I guess one thing I wanted to like, yeah, one of the other themes of the book, of course, is this idea of euphoria. So forest euphoria. And for me, that word is obvious, like, obviously people think of euphoria as joy, as like happiness, of contentment. And in the world of like queerness, it is used often to talk about sort of a sense of peace in one's body, a sense of joy of existing in as you are. And so when I was a child, and still now to some extent, though less acutely, like I would experience gender dysphoria, a feeling of like just out of body experiences where you're like, this is, my body is not correct. It's something is like I'm in the wrong form. And then that I didn't have the language or any education around that at the time, was far less commonly discussed in the early 90s, but and also just in my own family wasn't discussed. Um, and so like I wanted to talk about sort of the way in which nature can help someone sort of make peace with whatever aspect of their identity may not be considered normal. So for me, the word euphoria, it is not always this sort of jumping for joy, ecstasy kind of feeling. It's actually sometimes just a sense of like contentment, a sense of like, it's just, it is what it is. This is just like, and the all there's an infinite sort of way of form and expression in nature, and so can be said for the human experience as well. And there doesn't, I personally, not to be prescriptive, but I personally no longer feel a need to change, because I can see the ways in which nature has all this like multiplicity of form, and that's like a sense of comfort for me. So another aspect of it was like helping people find that comfort. And again, it's not to sort of say people should only need nature to find that comfort. Sometimes, and it is healthy to have to medically transition, or there's no prescription, but the point is that it's about helping you feel like that there's not anything wrong with you, right? Um, and so I think that then goes beyond gender or orientation and into sort of categories of ethnicity. So for me, like as an Armenian living in the United States in diaspora, but I'm also like half Irish. So there was this sort of kind of question of like, how do I'm not really, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, sometimes I don't feel Armenian enough. But then I was also not fully like, it doesn't make sense to identify any other way either. So there's this sort of constant feeling of like, well, I'm not really in this one category, right? I'm not anything at times. That's sometimes the feeling. And so there was this also like kind of urgency for me in helping like talk, and thinking about binaries as being like these fixed, pure categories. That's also not something that is really a biological concept, right? So it's not really true that in biology we have pure, clear lines, very established boxes. Usually things are much messier and unclear. And so that also was part of like this idea of the euphoria too, of just like, well, I don't have to have a kind of a conclusive, firm identity that is, that totally holds water. Like it's okay to have to sort of be in this in between. And then sort of to take it just to your point about organizing, I think that these are things I think we need to be a little bit more open to in organizing spaces as well. I've been guilty of, as being kind of militant at times about how I think people should behave, or, you know, how they should, what exact values they should be living in accordance with. But really, I think that we're in the extent of this like political moment is so, it's so vast and it's so profound that we really need as broad and as diverse and as dynamic as coalitions as we can afford. And so the feelings of like people who I can only be in community with people who are exactly as motivated to this kind of political will as I am. That I mean, it's not that we can't challenge people to, be better, be different in particular ways, but we also need to be willing to be in like sort of a messy kind of community because alone we will not be able to meet the.
Right. Right. So I'm going to go there are a couple of questions that have dropped in the chat that I'm going to go to. So I think I'm going to take the second one first because it relates directly to what you were just saying, which is with so much urgency in our culture and in the crises we face, how have fungi or other creature kin taught you to slow down or perceive time differently?
Yeah. I struggle with slowing down a little bit, like in terms of the, like I definitely have some, am a victim of the sort of puritanical culture of, not, I should never rest. If you're resting, you're wasting time. There, I struggle. I have to be mindful of that. I have anxiety. But I would say that I do think that my sort of day ritualistic and, almost daily ventures into the forest are like have been really deeply important for calming my nervous system, for relaxation in a way that then is restorative and gives me the capacity to do the work that I feel is necessary. And so I would say just like fungi in general, like I think they're wonderful teachers for things like, they're not always going to be there when you demand them to be, right? You walk through the forest maybe hoping that you're going to find a morel or hoping that you're going to see a particular species. And maybe all of the conditions are exactly right as you might expect for that species. And you go and you look and you're hopeful and they're not there. They have not emerged from the soil. They're underground somewhere. They're existing in their mycelial form, but they haven't fruited. And I think that that's a great lesson in sort of like entitlement, and it's also a lesson in pacing, and it's also a lesson in rest and like sort of kind of regrouping and kind of amassing your the necessary nourishment so that you can then take the form that you think is necessary eventually. And so sort of just being like open to the fact that you're not always necessarily able to snap into action all the time, right? That sometimes it's actually more strategic for the long game, to be slow, to be methodical, and to defy sort of like the capitalistic expectations of performance, like sort of on demand. So yeah, there's so many lessons from fungi in this sort of realm. But I think sort of making a habit of going out and looking at things, whether you're in a forested environment or if you're in Southern California or in New York City, like just going into just I like telling people to like maximize their species encounters, whatever those ecosystems are, just watching and sort of observing as much as possible. And you'll start to see all these different ways of being that can kind of be really great teachers.
I was going to say that for myself because I feel like we're living in a moment where the horsemen of the apocalypse are like lighting dumpster fires on every corner, every which way
Yeah.
you look, there's like some horrible thing going on. And so I have all these sort of mottos that I say to myself, from whatever an Armenian proverb or from organizers that I know, which is but one of the things that I found about going into nature, whether that's in Central Park in New York or upstate, when I'm, upstate, like in the countryside, I just feel like going out in nature is a sort of walking meditation. And it's a way of sort of resetting your central nervous system so that you then can do the things like Mariam Kaba says, choose your lane, find your people, Angela Davis, freedom is a constant struggle. Grace Paley, the only recognizable feature of hope is action. But in order to do all of that, you actually have to have a rootedness in a place, I think. and then make networks in the place that you're in.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Um, I've had to move a bunch of times as an academic, and so I was in grad school in Syracuse, and then I went to a postdoc in Lafayette, Indiana, and then I went to the Mid Hudson Valley to be a professor at Bard, and now I'm an hour north from there in Troy. And thankfully now I know that I'm here indefinitely, and I can really start to myceliate this particular landscape and community, and but it takes time to build those connections, and I'm grateful that like I'm now finally in the place to do that. So that was always the missing link. I had the wherewithal and the information to do more community work. And I did when I was in Syracuse, because that was like a 6-year period. But the other just 1, 2 year stints elsewhere were just not conducive to really being involved in a way that felt substantive, because you're not networked. You're not, you
You're
know,
not rooted to the place and to the
right.
community. So there are
Yeah.
two related questions here that I'm going to read together. And then, as someone who writes in both science and the arts traditions, how do you differ or overlap in your writing style? Number one. And related, how do your practices in science and creative writing inform each other? How do you have time for both, just practically speaking?
Hmm. Okay, yeah. So, right, both science and arts traditions. So I guess I think that it was actually once I had to do a little work, like some of my early drafts was me just like deprogramming from that intensively academic style of writing, both the science writing training and the theory. And I that took a little time because I was really steeped in those traditions. And they're functional. I'm not actually against either tradition of writing very abstract philosophy or theory and being highly technical in science. I think those are both really important. They're accomplishing a particular thing. Within those categories, there's good and bad writing. Um, but I think that it's fine for, experts in a field to communicate to each other with like within their little with jargon even. But I wanted to get more in into the realm of storytelling and into the realm of a traditional audience. So not, with not presuming any particular background. Um, and that did take a little bit of time. But then once I got into that, like once I kind of moved through that, I actually found it to be quite easy for me to relay my scientific observations or sort of my scientific knowledge in a more artful form, because that's how I actually see and feel about it. And it was more that I actually had been taught to minimize that over time, and it was actually about just getting back in touch with that. So I have always just had a very emotional relationship to biology, to the organisms around me, to like sort of nature itself. Like it's always been a deeply emotional thing. I have no formal training in creative writing, but I have always liked poetry quite a lot. I have never had any training in it, but when I was a grad student, I went to SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, and it shares a campus with Syracuse University. And they have a very good creative writing MFA program there. And I would go to a lot of like poetry readings from the students there, and then all the amazing writers they would bring in. Actually, and I saw Peter Balakian do a reading there once, which was very special. So I have always tried to seek out, I've always just really enjoyed that form. And so it was really fun to be able to like, okay, I can kind of experiment with form. I can take these scientific concepts that I have a natural emotional response to, and I can talk about them in both technical ways, and then I can also just allow myself to like play with sentences, to play with the language itself. And that was like actually once I realized I could be doing that, I was like, this is very fun. And so I guess there's difference in that like I could be a little bit interpretive and a little abstract in a way, when in the artistic side, which allows for that. And I didn't have to be so beholden to all of the, I didn't portray any of the science, I wouldn't say, but I could just like, I could infuse the science with an emotional element, and that I was free to do that in the writing. Um, and then the other question, how
Just,
you're,
yeah, how do you balance out, how do you find time for the writing,
oh,
given your, commit now you're the head of mycology at the New York State Museum.
yeah, it's a little hard.
Writing into your schedule.
Yeah. I mean, I is I do spend a lot of time working. I guess but I guess I don't, I mean, I'm not, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. I'm really busy, but I guess I would say that I find I don't, I'm also someone who like, really does, I kind of make time for myself. I really do try to like have some boundaries around when I work. This, the last 6 months have been quite the push. But then I'm, going to take August off from, I'll still have to go into work at the museum, but like I'm going to be doing like my field work, which is very relaxing. And then I'll be doing like, I'll take August off from like book events and I'll probably just watch a bunch of movies and stuff like
Well,
that.
for a last question, what is your next writing project? Like, do you have an idea already? Do you have anything in the
I
works?
do have an idea. So this project that's not so much my own book first. I'm going to be writing an introduction for Mary Banning's a woman mycologist who from the US who was forgotten for a long time, and I have her manuscript at the museum that was a collection of her mycological texts and these 175 amazing watercolor illustrations, and then also this incredible storytelling of her travels in the 1800s around Maryland where she lived looking for mushrooms. And it was never published, which is a great tragedy, and mostly on account of her gender. And so I'm going to be publishing her manuscript finally after like almost 200 years. And then I'm going to write the introduction to that, which is going to be like a sort of contextualizing her life and work in the history of mycology and sort of the intersection of mycology and gender, because a lot of women ended up being because mycology was not taken seriously by institutions and by men, it was often women who were taking up the study of mycology. So I'm going to write a little bit about that. And then I do have an idea for a book. Oh, and that book that will be published by Princeton University Press. But I have another general audience book idea. I'm not ready to share it yet because it's really just a little spore of an idea. But it would be more of it wouldn't be as much memoir. It would be I have a concept working that would be like that explores a particular way in which forests have been used over time. That's all I'll say for now. But it would be more of a, yeah, like this style, but not really memoir.
Well, Patty, thank you so much for this book. Thank you for your work. Thank you for this conversation. And I'm going to turn it back over to Olivia now to
Yeah, thank
say
you so
goodbye.
much.
Thank you both. This was such a treat. Thank you so much, Nancy, for hosting this conversation with such curiosity for Patty's work, and Patty for giving us the gift of this book. Thank you to Nasser and the Zorab Center for partnering with us to host this series, and to Gallus for co-sponsoring today's event. Thank you dearly to my colleague, Hobsep Markarian, Yala's executive director, without whom we could not operate, and to Nairi Simonian, our social media and marketing coordinator, for bringing this series to a wider audience. You can purchase Forest Euphoria and the Burning Heart of the World at Yala's bookshop.org storefront if you're based in the United States. And if you'd like to support our programming, you can donate at our website, armenianliterary.org. This year, we've begun offering workshops, and our next workshop, called I Thought I Was the Only One, will focus on queer Armenian narratives and will be held on July 12th. You can find out more at our website. Thank you all so much, and have a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Yala. Thank you, Gallus.